So we have completed the first step to build a Redux application. Now, the second step is defining the actions. What are some of the actions that a user can perform in our bug tracking application? Well, they can add a bug, they can mark a bug as resolved, and delete a bug. Now, in a real-life application, we could have many other types of actions. For example, the user can change the status of a bug, they can filter the list of bugs, they can change the sort order, and so on. For now, let's just focus on these actions. Now, earlier I told you that an action is just a plain JavaScript object that describes what just happened. Here's an example. We have an object with two properties, type and description. Type is the only property that Redux expects in your action objects. So if you don't have this type property, Redux is going to complain. Now here we're using a string as the value of the type property, but you can use any other type that is serializable, which means we can store it on the disk. Why? Because Redux is built on this principle that we should be able to store the state of our application on disk and reload from it later. Strings are serializable. We could also use a number here. But the problem with numbers is that they are not descriptive. We don't want to write code and compare the type of an action with, let's say, 124. Someone else reading our code would wonder, what is 124? They are not descriptive. Also, when you look at the action history in Redux DevTools, you don't want to see a bunch of numbers. You want to see a description of what has happened. That is why we use strings. Now, here I've used uppercase letters and I've separated these words using an underscore. This is a common convention in Redux code, but you don't have to follow it if you don't want to. Redux as the library doesn't care. You can use any naming convention that you prefer. I personally prefer a different convention like bug added. So I'm using a past tense because an action represents what just happened. Now here we have another property called description. So this is the data associated with this action. When the user types something in the text box to add a bug, we store that value in the description property. In a real application, we could have a complex form with many fields. The user can specify who reported this bug, what is the severity, and so on. In that case, we will store all those extra attributes in this object. Now, earlier I told you that Redux was inspired by Flux, which is an architecture pattern and a library built by Facebook. In Flux, actions have a slightly different structure. So they have two properties, type and payload. Payload is an object that contains all the data about an action. You don't have to follow this structure in Redux because Redux doesn't care, but I personally prefer this structure because it gives my actions a common and consistent structure. Let's look at another example. Here we have an action for removing a bug. So the type is bug removed. And in the payload, we have the ID of the bug. What is important here is that the payload contains the minimum information we need about an action. So if you're removing a bug, we don't need to store the bug's description or the date it occurred and so on. All we need to identify a bug is its ID. So now that we have an idea about our actions, next we're going to build our reducer.